You're going to hear me talk about destructive and non-destructive editing a lot. I don't want you to think that destructive editing is by nature a bad thing. What I want you to be is just aware of the way that you're using the tools, and if you're making permanent changes to your photograph on a pixel layer, that you're aware of that. The next group of destructive editing tools are the blending tools, so blur, sharpen, and smudge. Starting with blur, which is this water drop icon here, we can blur parts of the image. And I'm going to zoom in and show you what that does. It's a really straightforward, basic tool. All you have is a strength setting, and I have it cranked up to 100%, just so you can see what it does. So this rock is in focus here. If you want to take that out of focus, I'm just clicking and dragging over that rock area, and you can see it slowly going out of focus. I'll bring up the history palette and do a before after just so you can see after, before, after. It's very simple. It blurs parts of the image. Alternatively, sharpen. Same thing. It just has a strength slider. I'm going to crank it up to 100% and zoom in to 100% so we can see what's going on here. I'm going to just start sharpening. So I just click and hold, and you can see this is progressively getting more and more sharp. So this is a good example of destructive editing, and if I zoom in one more step, you can really see that destruction is actually happening to the pixels. So if I really sharpen, Photoshop's trying to add contrast to the pixels, because that's really basically what sharpening is, and it's really messing up the image. There's only so far that you can go with sharpening. You can kind of blur things out to a pretty strong degree, but sharpening with this tool should be done pretty sparingly. If your image isn't already in focus or sharp, you can use a little bit of this sharpening tool, but not much. You don't want to overdo it because it's really easy to see those undesirable results. The final tool in this group, it's the smudge tool, and it's also does just what it says. It's going to move pixels around. So I just click and drag, and you see how that works. It's actually smudging the pixels. Now, you can imagine using something like this to get maybe some painterly or like psychedelic effects if you're trying to create like an illustrational image from a photograph. This has a couple other settings here. You can sample all layers. Finger painting just gets slightly different effects, and you can experiment with that, and depending on the application, see if it feels better. It's easy to see how those blending tools are used directly on the photographic image, but what you might not expect is those tools from me are almost 100% tools that I use to manipulate masks. I rarely ever use them directly on a photographic image, a pixel layer. So I'm going to create a mask and show you how I use the blending tools. So in this image, I'm going to create a mask for the silhouette of the race car driver. And once again, I'm going to fall back on the auto select power of select subject. In images like this where you have a strong foreground subject, this tool does a great job. Double click on this layer, and I'm going to mask it. I'm going to apply this selection as a layer mask, and I'm going to bring up just a solid color adjustment layer behind it. I'm just picking a random color. I'm not really dwelling too much on creative decisions right now, but since this is a non-destructive workflow, I can continue to make changes. So here's the mask of the guy. I'm going to zoom in. You can see this is a really hard-edged mask, and the edge is a little bit chunky. It did a pretty good job, but there's a little bit of jaggediness to the edge, which generally I'd like to smooth that out a little bit. And you can do that in a uniform way. If I go up here to the properties panel for my mask, you see it says layer mask here, shows me that same shape, and I can adjust the feathering of the mask by turning this up. See how feathered that is? It's a little too much, but you can really achieve a subtle softening of the edge. Now let's go back, and by option clicking on the mask, you can see what that did. That's the original sharp edge. And if I crank the feather up just a bit, it's going to soften it. And that'll be a little bit less distracting. There should always be some bit of feather to your masking if you're doing compositing, so it doesn't look too fake and cut out. Since that applies that feather to the entire mask in a uniform way, there's no control to say, oh, right here I want it to be more feathered, but right here I want it to be sharper. You might run into that if you're compositing an object into a background that has a depth of field. One part of the object needs to be out of focus and another part needs to be in focus. Your mask has to reflect that. So let's say I only want to soften the mask edge on the torso and not on the helmet. I'm going to go grab the blur tool and click and hold down and just scrub back and forth. And you can start to see the mask soften right in that place. Now blur is pretty gentle, even though I have it set at 100%. You can see some softening there, but not a whole lot. So if you need more softening, switch to the smudge tool. Smudge is one of the most powerful mask manipulation tools that you can use. It not only moves the edge, but it softens it at the same time. 50% is usually okay for this tool. So look at that. I'm moving that mask edge back and forth. Keep in mind too that the smudge tool is pretty processor heavy. So if you're noticing it lag quite a bit, what you need to do using the bracket keys is just reduce the size of the smudge brush, because it works a lot better if it's smaller. It takes less processing power from your computer. I'm going to go back to the image. Now you'll really be able to see. So you could really use this for some cool creative effects if you wanted to maybe make it look like there's some lighting effects popping off of his jacket. You just manipulate the mask edge to use it as a special effect. Remember that workflow of creating paths and masks and assets that you're going to use throughout the course of editing your image. I want to show you how to fix an overly soft mask edge. This is non-destructive editing in terms of the photograph itself. You can back up your masks, you can back up your paths, and if you make an error that you didn't like, you can always go back to them. So to me, that's the least destructive workflow that you could use. Let's say blur and smudge are going to make the mask edge softer and more blurry. What do you think we can do with sharpen? Let's say I blurred this edge manually a little bit too much and I want to bring it back. I can use the sharpen tool on a mask to tighten up this edge. So I'll show you before and after what sharpen does to a soft mask edge. That's before, that's after. You can't push it too far with the sharpen tool, because if I try to work this edge, that's really, really smudgy. It starts to tighten up to a degree, but then it'll start to introduce a bunch of grain in there because it's trying to sharpen too blurry of an edge. But if you have something that's just slightly too blurry, you can use that sharpen tool to make the line more defined again. It's not really adding clarity to the image. It's not like you can pull new detail out of a photograph once you're in Photoshop. But what sharpening does is it enhances the contrast between edges. So it's almost like an optical illusion. So if you understand that principle about sharpening, it makes perfect sense why it works on a mask like this. It's just increasing the contrast between the black and the white. It's important to understand why we care about these blending tools in relation to masks. We're going to have to change a lot of the qualities of our mask edges as we work on an image. We're going to need to feather parts. We're going to need to sharpen parts. We're going to need to move parts around manually to improve integration. So if you understand the basics, the foundations of masks and how to make them, in addition to that, the tools to use to manipulate them, because there's really not a great rule book for that. And the tools in Photoshop don't really present themselves in a way that you would know right off the bat that they're used to change, improve, and manipulate masks. So that's why I'm teaching you this stuff. Keep in mind, the blend tools are a very important part of your toolbox when making masks.